When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." This is God's word. All right. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for all the people here. Wow, there's a lot of you. Thank you for John Reagan, who will be teaching us today. And thank you for all the amazing people in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Oh my God. Give it up for KJ one more time. It is great to be here with all of you this morning. I'm not used to holding the microphone. I'm used to the little earpiece guy. Okay, so be patient with me. Be kind. It is so good to be continuing our series, Behold, as we are beholding Jesus, this rabbi from Nazareth who changed the world. For centuries, men and women have dedicated their lives to following his example. Some generations who follow Jesus have taken great steps forward in changing the world just like him. For instance, the Benedictine monks that built the first hospitals across ancient Rome. They saw the works of Jesus healing the sick, so they believed they too could help the sick, studying, learning more, not forsaking them or letting them die. Some generations have taken no steps forward and needed to recheck what was happening. In 1517, Martin Luther posted his famous 95 Thesis and pointed out the flaws of the church, how there needed to be a change, how there needed to be steps that should be taken forward. But where are we today? Where are you in terms of your relationship with Jesus? If you could put language to where you are currently are, what would you say? Maybe you are not a Christian and you're here because of a friend, your grandma, or your spouse, or because you're curious why the people here love Jesus so much, why we love this church so much. Maybe today you are new to following Jesus and you're excited, but there are things in your life you aren't really sure what to do with. So you come to Sunday services for direction. Today you could be the one who has been following Jesus for some time, and you realize that every step you take forward, you feel like you take 2 steps back, right? Maybe you have been following Jesus for a very long time, and it's going great. You have your morning quiet time every day, your faith is strong, but you worry for those around you. What about them? Your faith has become carrying the burdens of those you love. Or maybe you used to follow Jesus. Now you run the opposite direction, or you took a break, and something is pulling you back. Maybe you're following Jesus, but feel like everything is wrong and you don't know why. Sin isn't easy to deal with. Shame and guilt weigh over you. You question yourself, you question your faith, you question God, and you think to yourself that your faith isn't good enough like it used to be. That maybe God is done with you. He doesn't think you're good and faithful. Do you feel like everything is spinning out of control and you're going backwards? Now, we all remember this movie from the 80s, and it's a hilarious scene of what it's like going backwards and when you realize, I've messed up. So we're going to have a clip here. Let's see.
Thanks a lot. Terrific. Thank you. What a moron. You're going in the wrong direction. You're going to kill somebody. You're going the wrong way.
All right, so humorous, funny, but what about when you're in that situation and you're the one that realized, was that me? Did I just do that? Following Jesus has stages, and sometimes it can feel like everything is wrong, and sometimes it's because it's our own fault. Maybe you aren't driving on the opposite side of the highway literally, but you feel like things aren't going to plan. You see the ones you love going the wrong way. You feel you have gone too far the wrong way yourself from God and you can't come back now. You want to get far away from Jesus as you possibly can, or you're curious about where you even are with Jesus. In the text of John 21, we pick up in a crucial moment for Peter. And so by studying Peter and Jesus, we'll hopefully see our story as well. Simon, whose name was changed to Peter by Jesus in Matthew 16, and who became one of his famous disciples. He has a lot of background. So let's dive into Peter's background. A fisherman who is called by Jesus to be a fisher of men in Matthew 4:19. After Peter can't catch any fish, Jesus tells him to throw his nets on the other side of the boat, and Peter listens. The net catches more fish than Peter can take in. So after that miracle, after that moment, Peter decides to follow Jesus. Jesus called him to recruit people and lead people into his kingdom. Peter was probably somewhere between the ages of 14 and 30. We don't know for sure or the precise age, but he had a lot of passion. He was passionate like a lot of us are at those ages. Passionate about the coming kingdom he believes in, that every young Jewish man was studying. Passionate about conquering Rome, the nation that was oppressing his people. And we know that he was married, so this guy had a lot of passion. Peter, nicknamed the Rock, which technically is what Peter means. There's a lot of study on that, so if you have more questions, you can talk to me after service. But he was the first to say that Jesus was the Messiah, and so Jesus was the first to name who Peter was, the rock where God would build his church. So a little side note. When you name what God is for you, God will name what you are for him. In those moments of doubt, in those moments of searching, When you name who God is for you, God will name who he is, who you are for him. But something Peter is known for consistently is acting before thinking. Can anyone else relate? He means well, but he tried too hard sometimes, overcompensated. Peter was the disciple who Peter was the disciple who saw Jesus walking on water in Matthew 14. And it says, if you command me to walk on, Peter says, if it's you, God, command me to walk on water. So Jesus says, all right, come on. Peter takes a step out onto the water, looks at the storm, falls in. He tried having big faith, and he took a big step, but eventually fails and falls in the water. Peter was also at the famous Last Supper. When Jesus says, one of you will betray me, Peter says to John, ask him who. And it's like, that's weird, Peter. That's sus. Sus as in suspicious. It's the new millennial talk. That's for my students out there. I love you guys. Peter, why are you bossing John around? In John 13, Jesus is washing the feet of his disciples to signify what type of leader he is and what he has come to do. Why did Jesus wash feet? So in that time and culture, washing feet was super important. You would be wearing sandals, and they didn't have plumbing like we do today, so depending on where you were, you could be stepping in who knows what. Now, washing someone else's feet is what slaves did. When you wash someone's feet, it was submitting yourself to serving that person. So Peter sees Jesus getting ready to wash his feet, and it's this symbol of him saying, I am going to serve you and submit myself to serving you. So Peter is very confused, and he says, wait a second. I should be washing your feet. I'm the student. You're the rabbi. You're the teacher. You're the Messiah. So Peter says, no, not doing that. But Jesus gently explains and says this, if I don't wash your feet, then I can have nothing to do with you. Jesus just shares exactly how he views us, what his goals are. And we'll touch on more on that later. But the feet washing was a physical act to show what type of leader Jesus was, and Peter misunderstood. So Peter rejecting it was rejecting him as the teacher, rejecting him as the rabbi. So then Peter explains, okay, fine, then if you'll have nothing to do with me unless you wash my feet, then wash my head and my hands too. But Jesus says, Peter, you're missing the point. Peter's acting before thinking soon takes a turn that hurts him and those around him. Jesus is preparing the disciples for his death in Matthew 16 and explains that he will suffer and die. Peter interrupts and says, never. You'll never die. We won't let it happen. They won't take you. They won't arrest you. We won't let this happen. In Matthew 16:23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Again, Peter misses the point, but argues with Jesus about it, trying to control a situation he has no control over. I've definitely done that. But God, you can't let that happen. Surely that's not what you want to do. All the while, I'm missing the point. Later in John 13, Jesus warns the disciples again, you can't come with me this time. I'm going to die. Peter says, all right, fine. If you're going to die, let me die with you. I'll go with you to the grave, Jesus. But Jesus knows the truth, and we know how the story goes. No. You want to now, Peter, but you won't want to when the time comes. You'll deny me 3 times, Peter. Jesus doesn't say this with anger or disappointment, but just saying, Peter, you're not there yet. Peter has a hard time accepting things Jesus says to him. Now, if you don't follow Jesus, then it's safe to say it's because you have a hard time accepting things Jesus says as well. But if you follow Jesus for any amount of time, then there's definitely been times where you're like, Jesus, I don't understand and I don't agree. It's kind of his MO. Peter wants to be able to have the right response, but when it comes down to it, he doesn't. Soon after, Jesus is arrested by Roman soldiers in John 18. Peter acts on his passion rather than what Jesus told him. He grabs his sword and he cuts a man's ear off. Now, Jesus had been teaching the disciples for 3 years prior to this moment. He had already taught his disciples that his kingdom is not about overthrowing Rome in Mark 12. You remember the story when expressing it with the religious leaders that they were trying to paint Jesus as a rebel to the Roman Empire and get him arrested by asking him about taxes, but Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He had no intention of overthrowing Rome. In Matthew 5:43, Jesus teaches to love your enemy and do good to those who persecute you. So Peter, grabbing his sword, was completely against what Jesus had taught him. In his passion and anger, Peter was ready to fight his enemy, the Roman who controls Peter's land. Jesus then definitely strongly warns Peter, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. So at this time, Peter has misunderstood his teacher, his rabbi, his friend, and the goals that he has. He's misunderstood. Questions start filling his head. Do I really believe what Jesus has been teaching me? Do I want this? Remember, Rome is oppressing Israel. It's not like it's like a bad president in office that Peter didn't like. Okay, they're oppressing the people of Israel. And Peter has been waiting for the moment where Jesus says, grab your swords, let's go. And so when Jesus is being arrested, put yourself into that moment. The person who's told you that they are your coming king, they are coming to save you, they're coming to rescue you, and you're like, awesome. Why are you being arrested and going to let them kill you? And you grab your sword and you're ready to fight. Peter wants to fight back. Jesus says no. Jesus, in Peter's mind, was the leader to help Israel get their land back. Jesus had no intentions of starting a war, a rebellion, or fighting for his own life. Jesus showed that he would rather die than strike. Peter, being the young, passionate man who desired justice, finally looked at Jesus and asked, do I want this type of justice? So when Jesus is in the courts being tried, someone asks Peter, aren't you one of his disciples? Peter, in his struggle of faith and courage, denies Christ not once, but 3 times. In the same court that Jesus was in. So it's not impossible that Jesus possibly heard his denial or saw his denial. Jesus told Peter he would deny him 3 times before the rooster would crow, and once Peter hears the rooster, he runs bitterly crying out of the court. Can you picture it? It's the moment he realized he gave 3 years of his life to a man that he thought would conquer the enemy Rome and rebel, and he was wrong. He believed in Jesus for the wrong things. Peter hated the idea of the man who would go back on his word, his country, and his God. How could they doubt the Messiah? I've seen him. I've been with him. Then Peter realizes what doubt feels like. He realizes what it means to follow a king with no weapons, no animosity, and no vengeance. Is this what I wanted? He asks. Then hearing a rooster crow, he is taken to the moment with Jesus, the one he loves and sees. He has become the very thing he swore he would never be. There are moments in my own life where I've woken up and I've realized I'm not who I thought I was going to be. Jesus, you're not who I thought you were going to be. Peter had lied about his friend, his rabbi, and his Messiah. I imagine Peter having so much guilt and shame. Today I believe there are a lot of you in the room who love Jesus, but you didn't realize what you signed up for either. Prayers let down, churches stabbing you in the back, Christians who've hurt you, questions going unanswered. So denying Jesus didn't seem so hard like it used to be, but your heart aches because you love him, and you don't know what changed. Now we know what the story says. Jesus rises from the grave, but they don't see Jesus every day. John 21 says in the passage we are in, this is the 3rd time seeing him since Jesus had rose. So we caught up on Peter's backstory before we come into John 21, right? And then we're going to read the first 3 verses, John 21, 1 through 3. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and the 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So remember, Peter was a fisherman. So when he learns that Jesus is alive, he is feeling the guilt and shame for what he had done. He remembers Jesus called him to be a fisher of men and thinks to himself, "I blew it. I became the failure I saw in others." He sees his mistakes and says, "Okay, I'll go back to what I'm good at." Then I think it's sad, but kind of funny that he catches nothing. So he probably felt like a failure following Jesus, and also probably felt like a failure of a fisherman. So he's just guilt, and I imagine a pity party, and I imagine just so much shame and brokenness. But Peter does go backwards in his life because he doesn't feel good enough to be what Jesus called him to be. He didn't feel like Peter the rock, but it felt like Simon the fisherman. So he goes backwards to being the nobody he felt he was. We tend to do that, don't we? It's like relapse. We say, well, I already messed up, so I might as well just fully mess up. This is called the abstinence violation effect. In The Willpower Instinct, Kelly McGonigal says, giving in makes you feel bad about yourself, which motivates you to do something to feel better. And what's the cheapest, fastest strategy for feeling better? Often the very thing you feel bad about. It's not the first giving in that guarantees the bigger relapse. It's the feelings of shame, guilt, loss of control, and loss of hope that will follow the first relapse. Or it's not a relapse going back to something bad to make you feel better. Rather, it's a place you're familiar with. Maybe you experience it less of a relapse and more just going back to what you're familiar with. It's the first place you go to. This is called regression. It can be helpful when we're in a healthy place. We go back to what we know in a really good way. Like when we're lost, we go back to the basics. We retrace our steps. When we're lost, we go back home. We're like, okay, let me go a different route. Regression can be good in that way. But regression can also be very painful and lead to very toxic behaviors. Like when you're around a family member that disapproves of you, you go back to acting like a child because it's familiar. You don't want to act like a child, but your brain takes you back to what's familiar. Regression is defined as this in the Fatherly article written by Chris Illuminati. Regression is both a defense mechanism and a psychological strategy used unconsciously to protect someone from the effects of unacceptable thoughts or feelings. Basically, when we're troubled or frightened, our behaviors tend to become more childish or primitive. We go on the defensive. Jenny Noe Gilson says, regression happens to people when they feel stressed or anxious, causing them to revert to old behaviors or habits they exhibited as a child because it is somewhat easier to do than face this stressor. Have you ever noticed that? You are around old friends and start behaving like you used to. But you're like, I've grown from this friend group. Or you're around parents or authority figures, you get stressed and act like a child or feel like a child. This is regression. You are going back to what you know, what to do when you're ashamed, stressed, or feeling lost. You're going back to those moments of, I was in pain here, I'm in pain now, I'm going to go back to that unhealthy habit or back to that mindset. A pastor says to you, you're a sinner and you're going to fall away. Regression will make you accept that as a fact, and you will start being that. An ex will say, you are incapable of love. So when your spouse asks you why you are getting distant, you are becoming who you think you are meant to be. You are regressing back to that old relationship. When you see how your children view you and told you how you would never be a good parent, you begin to accept that reality as true, choosing then to be a distant grandparent. As well, you're not progressing, learning, or growing, but regressing, hiding. You go back to who you think you are meant to be or what you have known. Peter goes back to what he knew, a fisherman. He goes backwards in his shame. Now notice this. Jesus called Peter the rock where he will build his church, a leader. When Peter was a fisherman, Jesus said, you are a leader. Notice that the others follow him fishing. He's still leading, even when he believes he is not good enough. So even when we are running from God, even when we don't feel good enough, even when we are in the possible wrong, God does not take away our callings or our gifts. When he gives gifts to us, we can't outrun it. This is important to remember. Romans 11:29, for God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn. I love the way the Amplified put it. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, for he does not withdraw what he has given, nor does he change his mind about those whom he gives his grace to, or whom he sends his call. So when you feel afraid for those you love, remember this. When you feel yourself have become the person you didn't intend, or you've gone too far, God doesn't change his mind about you. He doesn't take away your calling. He doesn't take away your gifts. All right, so John 21:4-8 says, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them while they were fishing in the boat, right? He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he had jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. Now, remember, Peter was called by Jesus to be a fisher of men after the first time Jesus told him to put his nets on the other side of the boat. Remember that? That was when Peter decided to follow Jesus. Jesus said, hey, throw your nets on the other side of the boat. It's a miracle. So, Jesus seeing Peter going back to what is familiar for him, Jesus will speak to him in what is familiar for him. Sometimes when you're lost and you're confused and you're like, God, I don't know what to do, he'll do something in a really similar way that you remember, that only you would remember. I've experienced many moments like that myself. Peter is met with familiarity by Jesus when he goes back to what's familiar. As soon as Peter realizes it's Jesus, he put his cloaks on, he jumps in the water, and he swims to Jesus. Now, remember the last time, I love this chapter, it's so good. Remember the last time that Peter saw Jesus when he was in a boat? He said, if it's you, command me to walk on the water. And he tries walking on water and he fails. This time, Peter accepts who he is and doesn't try to show big faith. He doesn't try to be just like Jesus. He just jumps in and gets to Jesus as fast as he can. If falling in the water was a lack of faith last time, this time jumping in the water was Peter saying, I know I can't do anything without you. I just want to be near you. I'm going to say that again. If falling in the water was a lack of faith last time, this time jumping in the water was Peter saying, I know I can't do anything without you. I just want to be near you. Again, the other disciples still follow Peter back to the shore. He is leading them in his brokenness. He is leading them back to Jesus. Peter was in a really bad spot. He denied his friendship with Jesus. Yet he's still leading people back to him. Yet who God called him to be was a leader, and he can't help but be that, even in the bad place. Point number 2, you're welcome to take a seat. John 21:9-14. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus, come, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So Peter denies Jesus, regresses, and yet Jesus invites him in, invites him to breakfast. Jesus doesn't wait for us to be fixed before he invites us in. Jesus doesn't wait for you to get your mess handled before he invites you to spend time with him. We hear this a lot at church, like on church ads, and it says, "Come as you are," and you think, oh, that's the cliche part of the sermon. But listen, it's a cliche for a reason. It's good, and it's true. We tend to believe God accepts us with the faults we accept, but once we make a mistake that we don't accept, God won't accept us either. Not only does Jesus invite him in, but notice Jesus already had fish and bread. Yet, he wants what Peter and the others caught as well. God wants to use what you have. He doesn't need it, but he wants it. He wants you to take part in it. He wants to take part with you at the table, take part with you in the meal. Remember, we talked about that last year in Jesus People series, people of hospitality, what the table represents, what hospitality and the meal can represent for someone. He invites us to the table, the most intimate place you can be with friends, feeding your body and your soul. He wants you to contribute with what you have, whether you think you're good enough or not. John 21:15-17. We'll continue on. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Now, first things first, notice Jesus calls Peter Simon, his old name. So curious by that, I started thinking about regression, and you could say, whenever Jesus called Peter Simon, it could be because he was acting like his old self. He was regressing, rather than being what Jesus called him to be, Peter the Rock. Jesus knows when Peter is regressing and progressing. He doesn't condemn, judge, or look with disappointment, but each time he says Simon. It's a call. Simon, you're not Simon anymore. Why are you acting like Simon? You're more than this. You can be Peter. You don't have to be Simon. I also found this to be interesting. Simon, pronounced in Hebrew, is Shimon. In Hebrew, it means listen. So Jesus is literally saying, listen to me. Simon, Shimon. Now Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" 3 times. Peter says yes 3 times, and Jesus responds each time with saying, "Feed my sheep, take care of my sheep, love my sheep." Now it's great, Peter's whole character arc. Like, you notice all of these repeating patterns, the walking on the water, and then he just jumps in, right? And like, there's this chapter in John 21 is repeating things in story's narrative to tell you about his character arc, to tell you about what's about to come. I think it's a lot of fun. Why does he bring up loving his sheep, feeding his sheep, rather than the big mistakes that Peter made? Remember when Peter told Jesus, "I love you, I'll even die with you," in John 13? Peter interrupted something that Jesus was teaching. He was teaching love others. In John 13:31-37, when he was gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, they will know you are my disciples, if you love one another." Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later, Peter. But you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." So Jesus is saying, let's go back to that topic that you interrupted me to share your opinion. If you love me, Simon, remember this. Listen. Shimon, you must love one another. This is how they will know you are my disciples. Do you love me, Simon? Then love my sheep. They weren't able to finish that conversation, and before Peter could move, they weren't able to They weren't able to finish that conversation, and before Peter could move forward, Jesus reminded him of what was most important. Peter probably had a hard time loving his enemy with the sword, loving his friends, Jesus, and the other disciples, John. And by that, he couldn't love Jesus correctly. So often I fail. Jesus takes me back to a lesson I couldn't learn and says, remember this conversation? We never finished it. I always think Jesus is going to bring up the big failure that I'm stressed about, but he usually brings up a conversation that I ignored and he wants to finish. You may be scared to meet with Jesus because he's going to talk to you about that one big mistake that's looming over your shoulders, which he may, but maybe he will just remind you of a conversation you needed to get back to. Jesus doesn't say, you denied me, you fake friend. You don't love me. You're a liar. He says, remember, if you love me, you must love others. Verse 18 to 22, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw that the disciple from whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. I'm going to invite the band up. Now, Jesus says to Peter, when he is already down, oh, by the way, you're going to go somewhere you don't want to go. You're going to be executed. Very comforting, Jesus. Thank you. I'm already down about my guilt and my shame and my mistakes. Now follow me, Peter. It won't go how you expect, and you won't get an answer, but follow me. Peter responds like, okay, that's fine. What about John? Now, maybe out of concern for John or jealousy, I don't know why Peter cares, but again, Jesus says, that's not for you to know. We could ask, well, what about that guy in the church? Are you going to forgive them? Give her a big calling? Give them a second chance? So many of us, myself included, want Jesus to answer every question we have, but Jesus doesn't say he'll give us answers. Someone once told me, you think you have all the answers in the Bible? And I was like, no. That's why I follow Jesus, because he has all the answers. I don't. And you're not alone. To this day, I've asked Jesus for answers that I still haven't gotten. And yes, it can be terrifying and lonely, but I love Jesus, and I know he wants me to love his sheep. We're the sheep, right? Called to love one another, just like Peter. Now, maybe you don't relate to me and Peter at all, but I sure do relate a lot to Peter. So Jesus says, follow me. Now, Peter wasn't the only one who denied Jesus. That same night, there was also Judas, and he was the one who turned him in. Judas felt the same guilt and shame, but he ended his life when breakfast was waiting for him on the beach. And now there is us, left with the question, will we let our disappointments, our misconceptions, or our failures keep us from Jesus? Are we going to continue trying to have faith to walk on water when we could just jump in, mistakes and all, swimming as fast as we can to Jesus? Being like, I may have it wrong, but I'm going to Jesus. I'm going to go get to him as fast as I can. I'll get it right when I'm with him. To be near Jesus. Jesus isn't letting any of it get in the way of his breakfast plans for us. After restoring Peter, forgiving him, not even bringing up his mistakes, he desires the same for you. Behold, Jesus, the restoring God. Behold, Jesus, the forgiver. Behold, Jesus, the faithful one. Behold, Jesus, the mystery. Behold, Jesus, the coming King. Behold, Jesus, the lover. Behold, Jesus. What will we do with this man? Here at Zion, not only do we want to hear the message, but we want to have an opportunity to respond. And so now is the time where you're going to see leaders up here, Pastor Andrew, myself, others. We're here to pray for you if you need it. We're here to talk to you about what's going on. You don't have to share everything. You don't have to go into great detail, but share what you want. Ask for prayer.